Hello and welcome to the fourth video that I'll be posting on my Java tutorial series. And in today's video we are going to talk about loops. And loops can be used especially when we're dealing with array logic, as well as covering up repetitive code that we don't really want to type in. And that will also all be covered in loops, and array itself will be covered as the series progresses and probably in the next few episodes. So the first thing that we're going to do in today's video is, of course, open up our Visual Studio Code. And we're going to let it load for a while, and just like always, we're going to click on the new file, and we're going to name a new, or make a new file called loops.java, because we want to keep everything organized. And as always, we're going to type in public class loops. And inside of that, we're going to type in public static void main string args. And as we've discussed before, this code right here is used to tell the computer that this is all the code that we want to run. Okay? So once we're done with that, we can start on the loops discussion. And unlike if statements, we only have two types of loops. So let me just type it down here. Two types of loops. And the first type is the for loop. And the second type is a while loop. And a for loop is a type of loop that is used when we know the amount of times looped. Meanwhile, while loop is used when we don't know amount of times looped. So if we know that we want to loop the code for 5 times, we're going to need to use a for loop. But if we don't know how many times we're going to loop the code, then we have to use a while loop, because while loop is flexible that way. Okay, so before I start typing in the code for loop, I'm going to type in the for loop format, which is written down in this way. Let me just actually do a multi-line comment because we want to type the code beneath it. So yeah. This is the for loop format. Okay, here we go. For, and then that is our, for indicating the for loop, or this for keyword here is used to identify the for loop, or indicate to the computer that we are referring to the for loop. So for, and then inside of the for, we have a bracket, and inside of the bracket we have the integer variable, and we need to make sure that we directly assign it. So directly assign it to a value, and then we need to put a semicolon, and then we have a statement or condition. And you know what, let me just simplify that to statement, because this is what we learned in the previous video. It's statement. So yeah, we're gonna type in statement here, and then at the end we have a interesting feature for loop, which is updating the integer variable that we made. So we're gonna type in variable plus plus. We also need to put a curly bracket at the end. Click on enter, and this is where the code will be looped, or this code right here will be the one that's going to be looped. Okay, and that is essentially it for the for loop format. And in real life cases, of course, this is really helpful when we want to deal with names, or like repetition, like name 0, and then name 1, and then we have name 2, three, and etc and etc. So what we can do here is use a loop format. Actually, let me change this 3 to something like 5. We can use this loop format here to actually print out our values like this. And I'm going to type in the for loop using the for loop format. So we're going to type in for, and we're going to make a integer variable. So integer int. We're going to name this variable 1. is equals to, let's say, a value like 0, and then the statement. Statement is, as we have discussed before, using the condition operators, and you can just check in the previous video if you're wondering how to do that. So yeah, variable 1, and then let's just say is less than and equals to 5, and then we can just use the final unique, which is the updating the variable we made. So variable 1. And then you might be wondering, what do we type in inside the for loop? We can just type in this, just copy paste this, because I am lazy to type it down again, and we can just make sure, or add this variable. And this is a concept that we have discussed before, using the system.out.println, using integer and variable values. And if we click run right now, we should get 0, 1, 2, 1 to 5, and then we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that is the for loop essentially. Let me just comment this because you might get some confusion because of that. Let me kill the terminal, click on run again, and there you go. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As you can see here, it prints out the repetition of code, and it just does it without us needing to type, name 0, name 1, name 2, name 3, name 4, name 5. We can just do it with this 3 line of code right now. And that is what we are going to be really discussing about, especially logic. And that's it for the for loop. Actually, let me just comment this as well inside of the same multi-line comment so that we can get an easier perspective of what's the code running for. And then we're going to type in or learn about while loop now. So I'm going to type in again the while loop format, which is essentially much more easier than the for loop, but in my opinion for loop is much more better to use because in most cases you already know how many times you're going to loop the code for, so yeah, you can use for loop. While loop is used when you don't know the amount of times you want to loop it for. So yeah, both are really important to understand, but in my opinion for loop is usually the one that's being used. So anyway, we're going to type in while, and then just like the if statement, we have the condition or statement, and the statement, just like the if statement, is true or has to be true for the while loop to run. If it's not true, then the while loop will not run. And then after the statement, we have the curly brackets, enter, and we have our code that will be looped. So this is just like the for loop, where inside of the curly brackets we have the code that's going to be looped. Code that will be looped. And while loop is much more harder to use because if you were to type in a mistake like this here, so let's just say while, let's make a boolean because booleans are easiest to identify using true or false statement. Boolean while run is equals to true, and then we're going to type in while run for the condition, while run or statement is equals to true, curly brackets, and we're going to type in system.out.println hi, like that, I guess. Click on run, and you can see that it's essentially running forever. And that's because, let me just kill the terminal first. And that's because the while loop will essentially run forever. When I mean forever, I mean forever, unless this condition is false. So if you have a while loop and you have a condition that's always true, and when I mean condition for statements, if you have a statement that's always true, then the while loop will run forever. Basically, the code here inside our curly brackets will run forever. and there's no other way to stop it unless you account for it in the logic. Meanwhile, in a for loop, of course, you have the statement here and an updating variable that allows you to manipulate the condition. Meanwhile, in a while loop, you don't actually have that. And that's one of the disadvantages in while loop. After being able to run infinite amount of times, you have to make sure that the logic is strong enough so that it can actually stop whenever you want it to stop. And you might be wondering, how do we stop this? You can just say here, while run is equal to false, which makes our Boolean value here false. And since false is not equals to true, then this statement here is false or not true, then the while loop will stop. So it's just going to print out one high, and that's it, because the while run is false here. And that is essentially what's going to happen when you're dealing with while loop. You have to make sure that the data is essentially manipulated in a sort of way where at the end of the day, the condition here has to be false. And once the condition is false, the while loop will stop running. And for your information here, the for loop can also be made inside of a while loop. So let's just make a for loop using while. So while, of course, we're going to have a variable. Just say variable2 is, let's just do the same thing as the for loop here. We're just going to make a integer variable. So integer variable2 is equals to 0. And if variable2 is less than or equals to 5, so it will run until until the variable2 is greater than 5. So basically it will continue running as long as variable2 is less than 5, and then you have the system.out.println. Should I use the same output? Maybe I should, yeah, okay. I'll just use the same output so that you guys can essentially understand how to make a for loop using while. Have this, and then we have to add the variable2 plus. Okay. So if we click on run right now, it should give us name 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. And this is how you make a for loop using while. And essentially, it's just the same thing as a for loop here. As you can see, the for loop has a variable. That's why we have a variable on top. And then we have variable 1 is less than or equals to 5, which is essentially the condition, which we also have in the while here. And then we have this condition or unique use of being able to add itself. And we also have that here. And essentially, while loop can be converted to for loop. So for loop is created from this while loop right now. So that's why I did say that when you're dealing with looping a code that you already know a specific amount of how many times you want to loop, you use a for loop, because making this is much more harder than just typing this 3 line of code. Whereas if you don't want to use the for loop, you have to type in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You need to type in 5 lines of code, or it will take up 5 lines. Meanwhile, in a for loop, it just takes in 1, 2, 3. And of course, this is just simple logic. As we go on, the logic expands and you need more and more and more and more lines. So that's why I suggest again, if you're dealing with a case or problem where you need to loop it for a certain amount of time, or the certain amount of loops is already given or known, use a for loop, because you already have all of this inside the for loop, and it's just gonna save a lot of time. Anyway, that's it for the for loop and while loop, and I'm going to teach about the keywords. But before I teach about that, I want to ask you guys to do this as part of a challenge, which is to print out or have something like this. Something like a box right here. Pause the video right now and try to use the for loops and while loops to print out something like this. So pause the video right now and do the challenge. Okay. So for those of you who did manage to do it, great job. But for those of you who don't know how to do it, it's fine. It's part of the learning process. So what you're going to do to solve a problem like this or make or output something like this, you're going to use a for loop because we already know that we have 3 lines. So we need to output this once, output this another time, and output this again. So in total, you're going to need to loop it 3 times. I'm going to make a for int. We're going to make an integer variable called box counter is equals to 0. And do take note that the box counter or the name of the variable depends on you. You don't need to follow the name of the variable that I made, but you can, use any name you want for the variable. And this is discussed inside of the variables.java video. So if you're confused again, you can revise and look at the past videos. So for int box counter equals to 0, or let's just say 1. And that's another concept I want to actually teach you. But let me type in the code first. So box counter 3. Then box counter plus plus. And then we have system.out.println. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Click on semicolon and yeah. Let me click on run. As you can see, we have 3 lines and we have the same code output as well. Okay, so that's how you do the challenge. And here's a concept. The variable, remember that this is a variable here. So that means it can store any value. It doesn't have to be 0. It can be 5, it can be 6, it can be 7, it can be 10. It's up to you. Because remember that this is a variable. So we can store any amount of data. But in this case, for the logic, I'm going to use 1, and if it's greater or equals to 3, which is why we loop it 3 times. If I were to use 0, then this will give us 4 lines because 0 starts first, and then it loops 1 time and it becomes 1 because of this box counter plus plus. And then it checks the condition, okay, that's less than 3, and then it loops at up to 3 times, which is why we have 4 lines. Another concept that I want to teach you as well is the plus here. You can also type in plus equals to 2, plus equals to 3, plus equals to 4. And that is fine because the plus is essentially written down as plus equals to 1. Or increment is essentially plus equals to 1. So yeah, you can change almost anything inside the for loop as long as the logic makes sense. And that's it for the challenge, and we are going to talk about the last 2 terms inside today's video, which is the keywords. We have 2 keywords other than the loop keywords, and that is the break. Let me just tap that right now. Break keyword and continue keyword. And by definition, of course, the break keyword is essentially stopping the action, or in this case, the loop. So stopping the loop. And continue is, you might have guessed it, proceed the loop or action. Anyway, with that said, let's see the implementations. So for this demonstration, I am going to comment everything first so that we don't have any disturbance when we want to output the code or any weird output from code running. So we're gonna make a for loop first, of course, for int I is equal to 0. And in this case, of course, I made the integer variable I. So int I is equal to 0, I is, let's just say, 10. Let's make that 1 so that's easier to understand because you start with 1 and then I plus plus, and then let's just system.out I. And if we click on run right now, we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And that is the output. Now, when we implement the break here, we can use an if statement. So let's just say if I is, equals to 5, you break the code. And let's see what happens here. If we click on run, you can see that we stop at 4 because when we do looping, we do like, okay, let's just say 1, and then it checks, okay, is 1 equals 5? No. We print out 1, and then we, go back up, and then we have the I++, which makes the I value to 2. Is 2 less than or equal to 10? Yes. 2 is not 5, so we don't break it. Then we print out, then we do the repetition until it says I is 5, I is equals to 5, and it breaks. And what break essentially does is it stops the loop completely. The loop is not called any longer, and that's it. It's the end of the story. The loop stops. And as you can see here, we literally have the same code here. Without this, we can print 10, but once we reach 5, we stop. And this also applies if we, say 6. If we say 6, and we'll stop at 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it stops. And that is what break does. It essentially breaks the loop, or stop the loop action. So you just need to, okay, 1 to 10, and then if I is equal to 6, it breaks, so no longer will the loop run. And what happens if we use continue in this case? So let me just type in 5 again. And let's try to type in continue. If we have continue, you can see here 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it becomes 6. And from continue, which means proceed the loop, it essentially skips number 5. So the continue keyword here is like, okay, so if we have 5, we have 5 is equal to 5, we continue. So we just skips 5 and then brings back to the top of the for loop, and then it runs again. So basically, the continue keyword here will act as a sort of skip. So it skips, it returns back to the 4, and then it goes like 4, I is equal to 6, 6 is larger, less than or equals to 10, and then we print out 6, and then 7, 8, 9, 10. So that's the difference between break and continue. So let me revise everything. We have two types of loop, for loop and while loop. For loop is used when we have the amount of times loop, or we know the amount of times loop, and while loop is when we don't know amount of times loop. A for loop has a format where we have a for keyword, and then we make an integer variable with a value, we have the statement, and then we have the unique variable plus equals to, or updating the variable. And then outside of the bracket, we have the curly brackets, and inside of there is the code that we are going to loop. And we know that loop is essentially used to, cover up our messy repetitive code where we don't want to really type in large amount of the same thing over and over and over again. And then that's it for the for loop. We have the while loop, which is a while and then statement, and then the code that will be executed inside of it, inside the curly brackets. And then the while loop runs whenever the statement is true. If the statement is, true forever, then will continuously run forever until the statement becomes false. Meanwhile, for loop will run as well in a certain amount of time because you have a condition based on numbers that are updating. Meanwhile, while loop is not. It's just a statement that's true, it will run. If it's false, it will stop. That's it for the while loop. You also got to learn that we can essentially create a for loop using a while loop, which is done with 5 lines of code. So it's much better, concluded that for loop is much better when we know the amount of times that we are going to loop the code. And then you also did your challenge as well, which is the use of the for loops, the basic for loops. And we have our keywords here, which is the break and continue. Break here stops the loop, and if it's continue, it just like skips, or whenever the value here or the if statement is true, it continues or like returns back. It doesn't proceed to this, but it just directly goes here from line 65 back to 63 with the I value 6. Or just like, okay, this is 5 and then 5, and then it's like, no, we gotta go back to the top again to 63, and we just say I is equals to 6. So it's like skips 5 and then goes back to top 6. And that's it for today's video. I hope that you get to learn more about loops, more about Java programming, and yeah, I hope you get to enjoy the learning process, and I'll see you in the next video.